we move into our discussion of waste and compost, which is where we're going, just want to revisit real quickly the drawdown models that we introduced in our very first meeting, which is now several months ago. And if you remember, the gray box in this slide is the atmosphere, and that's that same atmosphere carbon pool that we saw in the video just a couple minutes ago. Sources on the left, those are where all of the greenhouse gases are coming from, and our sinks on the right, which is nature. That's our biosphere and soils and oceans from the carbon cycle slide. Those are helping us out and taking carbon out, and 60% of what we put in still remains in the atmosphere. And just like Passion Murphy said in the soil story, the question is, what do we do with all that excess? Because it just keeps accumulating more and more and more every year. And this is the great part about drawdown. So as they focus upon these sources, all the solutions that they present are about changing the ways we draw from that fossil pool and actually generate electricity and food and transportation and buildings and industry, and do all these things in ways that don't continue contributing to our atmosphere. And then when we shift over and look at the solutions in land and ocean, all of those are about increasing the carbon storage capacity of our biosphere, our soils, and our oceans. Okay. So with that, I want to transition into our kind of discussion about waste and compost, which is where we're going to spend the rest of the evening. And last month we teed up this discussion a little bit, and we talked about how waste has grown in the United States. And in 2020, we were generating 300 million tons of waste as a country, and that was up 150% from just 50 years ago. And individually, it's kind of the same story, 1,800 pounds per person, which has also grown by 54%. And all of that waste ends up in a landfill. And, we don't think about landfills a whole lot other than, there's some place where all our trash goes, right? And in preparing for this, I actually had to kind of take a deep dive into a landfill or into landfills and learn about them. And I was surprised by several things. So let's talk about this in a little bit. Before the 1930s and 40s, we used to burn the majority of our trash. Landfills are relatively new. There's two problems mainly with landfills. So the first thing is that as all this waste decomposes, it generates methane. And methane's a really powerful greenhouse gas. It's anywhere from 25 to 86 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And that methane that gets generated, if it was in a normal decomposition process, would be carbon dioxide instead. The second problem is that as water collects on landfills and percolates through, it creates leachate. And leachate is, if you think about water mixing with all of the toxins and trash and everything, and decomposing matter, and then dripping down through the landfill into our groundwater, that's exactly what leachate is. We started these in the 1940s and 50s. By the 1970s, this was a huge national problem. You might have heard of Love Canal in New York. It was one of the highest profile kind of environmental disaster sites in the 70s. And that really prompted a whole bunch of legislation. And that legislation led to our modern landfills, which look a little bit different. So let's look at those. The first thing, it's required now that landfills actually have plastic and clay liners to contain all of that leachate. That leachate, so it doesn't just sit there and accumulate, actually is pumped out and processed and cleaned like municipal wastewater is done. And then the methane gas is actually, in most cases, collected out of landfills. Sometimes it's burned and turned into electricity. It's not exactly a green energy source because burning methane actually releases carbon dioxide. But that is a better process than just releasing methane directly into the atmosphere for sure. About 50% of our open landfills currently are actually generating electricity this way. And finally, landfills are also required to drill a series of monitoring wells around the landfill. And this actually tests the groundwater for pollutants and contaminants to make sure that leachate is not actually dripping through the landfills. So this all sounds great, right? And you say, well, this is wonderful. Landfills sound like a good solution, better than burning. So what's the problem? Well, there's actually four. And the first one is these containment liners. They are designed to fail. They are going to fail. Every landfill that we have in the country, depending on how they constructed the liner and when it was done, there's somewhere between a 5 and 75-year lifespan of the liners. So they are 100% going to fail. They're literally designed that way. They're only warranted for 20 years by their manufacturers. And the other thing that we've discovered is that you really can't repair them. When they start leaking, it actually causes more harm to dig them up and try and fix the leak than it does just to let it leak slowly. So they literally are not repairable at this point. The second problem is that trash takes a really long time to decompose. Some of our trash, not all of it, but things like water bottles are 100 to 450 years. Aluminum and steel cans, think of a paint can that gets thrown away, 200 years to decompose for that. Diapers, 500 years to decompose. Batteries, I cringe every time I think about how many AAA batteries I've thrown away in my life, but they're over 100 years to decompose. And when you combine this time frame with the fact that our containment liners are going to fail in 50 to 75 years, that means that half of the life of decomposition or more is going to happen after our containment liners have already failed. The third thing is that there's no long-term monitoring in place. The legislation actually requires that landfills be monitored for 30 years after they close. Most landfills will be open for 20 to 30 years. So let's say maximum of 60 years that a landfill will actually be monitored. Okay. So again, you think back to the numbers we just went over. The containment liners might last 75 years. So that means, 10, 15 years after we stop monitoring is when all the liners will fail, things will continue to decompose. And it literally is just going to be a problem that we don't have any visibility into. Okay. The last problem, and this is like, it's so many things that we've seen as we've been going through this program, is that landfills really intersect with racial, economic, and health inequities and justice. If you live near a landfill site, it increases your exposure to air and groundwater pollution, and it's associated with a whole host of health issues. A 2019 study found that 78% of people living near landfills experience health issues like respiratory issues, eye irritations, increased flu frequency, and body weakness, which is a result of methane primarily. From an economic standpoint, all of the communities surrounding a landfills actually bring down land values and actually lower the economic value of that land. And because of those two things primarily, finding locations for landfills is really hard. And you get a whole bunch of pushback from communities. You're not going to put a landfill near me, and that not in my backyard syndrome that people talk about is very, very prevalent in discussions around where landfills go. And as a result, landfills most commonly end up near our poorest and our communities of color. And they're the communities that are already the most impacted by environmental change. And we add landfills as another layer of injustice on top of that whole existing structure. Dr. Jennings mentioned in his video earlier that, habitation built on separateness rather than mutual belonging is immoral. And as I was preparing this and we were thinking about all of this, the economic, racial, health, environmental impacts of landfills, it just feels immoral to me to think that this is not a morally correct way of dealing with our waste. So what do we do about it? Well, before we go there, there's one last thing we need to look at, which is how many landfills there are. And there are a lot of them. There are over 3,000 active landfills just in the United States. The red dots on this map are the open landfills. There's another 10,000 landfills that are closed. A lot of those landfills were created before 1970, and there's literally no monitoring or liner systems or containment systems at all for those. So what do we do about this? Well, we know that burning waste is also bad, releases stuff right into the atmosphere. But here's the thing that's really interesting. Half of the waste that goes into landfills is actually compostable. So you might remember from a couple sessions ago, we talked about food and food waste, and food waste is the single largest component of landfills. And when you add food waste with cardboard and wood and other organic material, it's over half of the material that goes into landfills is actually compostable. So there's a really easy, direct way to take half the stuff out of our landfills just with composting. The remaining 50% was really the focus of our session last month when we talk about purchasing and responsible purchasing and living simply. That's all of the stuff that we buy that's made in plastic or covered in plastic or designed to fail, this idea of planned obsolescence. So when we choose longevity items instead of single-use items, when we choose to keep something for a few extra years instead of throwing it away and buying something new, when we purchase carefully, that all of that helps to reduce the remaining 50% of stuff that is not compostable from going into landfills. So the point of all of this is not to shame anybody or do any of that. I mentioned, batteries, but, I think about the diapers and shoes and clothes and all of the things that we've thrown away in our lifetime. I and my family are as complicit in this as anybody else. But now that we know, and now that we see some of this, the question is, what do we do about it? And I think, especially as Christians and members of the church, we have a responsibility to model a different way, to really introduce and share a different way of handling this. So with that, I want to transition this story to compost because it is a really effective way of doing some things.